Welcome to the Partial Historians.
We explore all the details of ancient Rome.
Everything from political scandals, the love affairs, the battles waged, and when citizens turn against each other. I'm Dr. Rad.
And I'm Dr. G. We consider Rome as the Romans saw it, by reading different authors from the ancient past and comparing their stories.
Join us as we trace the journey of Rome from the founding of the city.
Hello and welcome to this brand new special episode of The Partial Historians. I am Dr. G.
And I am Dr. Rad.
And we are going to discuss the second half of Cleopatra, the blockbuster film from 1963 starring Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. And this means that it's a follow-on from our part one, looking at the same film, but it also means things are about to get far more complicated in terms of things to do with the production and things to do with Cleopatra and Mark Antony.
Absolutely. We definitely recommend you go back and listen to our part one. But just to set the scene, Dr. G, do a quick little recap. In part one, where we were focusing a little bit more on the first half of the movie, where it was about Caesar and Cleopatra's relationship mostly, we highlighted how this production was beset with problems from the get-go. They had ongoing issues with weather being unusually temperamental, which meant that sometimes their sets were damaged or sometimes they just couldn't film. We also have the ongoing issues of Elizabeth Taylor's health, in spite of the fact that she was one of the most beautiful movie stars of all time and commanded an insanely high fee to play Cleopatra. Just goes to show you that money cannot buy you happiness or health. She was plagued with lots of health issues throughout this production, including a particular bout of, I believe, pneumonia, which almost killed her. It meant she actually had to have an emergency tracheotomy and then plastic surgery to cover up the tracheotomy scar. On top of the fact that the film company that was producing this movie was in dire financial straits. Cleopatra was meant to be the movie that saved the studio. Spoilers. It did not.
We've got to spend money to make money.
Yeah.
That's how it works in the film industry.
That's all right. That's how it works. So there's all sorts of complications. And of course, all of these issues have a domino effect sometimes in that we've seen how Elizabeth Taylor's health problems meant that casting issues arose because the initial Caesar and Antony they had to be recast, etc., etc. So it has been complicated. And they've had to relocate from Pinewood Studios in England to Cinecittà in Rome. And this is where most of the actual filming takes place because there was very little done in England, unfortunately.
Well, fair enough. And the weather is apparently nicer in Italy anyway and more conducive for Taylor's health, as we've discussed in the previous episode. So probably good news for her, really.
It is, but even in Rome, they did still have unusual weather problems. Like I believe there was a particular day where it rained so hard their forum set flooded, like really badly, and they couldn't film. And this is what keeps happening, because I must admit one of my big sources for preparing for this episode was Walter Wanger and Joe Hyam's My Life with Cleopatra, which is essentially Walter Wanger's kind of diaries from when he was the producer of this film, because this was really his baby from the get-go. He was the one that really drove a lot of this production. And when you're looking at it in diary form, I actually feel quite sorry for him in many ways, because there are just so many times where he'll be like, Rex Harrison called in sick, Richard Burton too hungover to shoot, Elizabeth Taylor had more medical issues. It's just endless. And then on top of that, you add in the diary entries where he says something like, it was too cold, there wasn't enough this, there wasn't enough that, it was too rainy. Like there's just endless delays where they can't film what they were intending to. Or there was even one instance where they shot a scene between Antony and Cleopatra, and one of the issues they faced was that they were filming in this Todd-AO cinematic style, one of these widescreen technologies. And this is partly because it benefits Elizabeth Taylor, because who invented Todd-AO? Why, her third husband, Mike Todd, who died tragically in a plane crash. That wasn't nice, but it did mean that she inherited his Todd-AO filming method. But it's an incredibly cumbersome way to film. And none of the Italians' studios have a way of actually processing the film, viewing the film, etc. So what they would have to do is every time they shot something, they had to fly it back to America to get processed, etc. And then it would get flown back. And apparently there was a particular scene that they shot, and then on the flight, the film wasn't packed properly and it compromised the quality. They couldn't process it. It came out all like foggy and weird. And so they had to reshoot it. And it's just this kind of stuff that seems to keep on happening, just endless delays. In fact, one of my favorite delays, which I think you will also appreciate, there was even an incident where a cat managed to get into the set and give birth to kittens underneath Cleopatra's bed. And they realized that they were there because all of a sudden these tiny little newborn kittens screamed during a love scene between Cleopatra and Antony. So they had to pause filming.
That's incredible.
They then had to, I think, actually dismantle the set, probably dismantle the bed, because whilst they could get the mother cat out relatively easily, these kittens were so young, they were still blind and couldn't see what on earth was going on. So they were going to be coaxed out by food or anything like that. And it cost them in delays and labor and all of that kind of stuff, $17,000 just to get rid of these cats.
Wow. Okay. The fateful cats interrupting the filming. There is a really particular scene in this second half of the film where Cleopatra and Antony are having an argument of some kind, or a really intense conversation where they're disagreeing about something. And it's shot in so many different ways and in different costumes, almost to kind of suggest that this is an ongoing conflict that they have. But you get the feeling from the production side that this is actually because, for whatever reason, there were some complexities with shooting it and they weren't able to get everybody in the same place, in the same time, in the same costumes. And so they were just like, we'll just shoot it in pieces and we'll just piece it all together from whatever we've got. Or it's a mishmash to make sense of something that was a lot bigger and more complicated that did take place over a number of different scenes. And in the end, they were like, we don't have time for this. We're just going to have to Franken-scene it into some sort of montage argument. And I was like, wow, guys, wow.
Yeah, I believe that's when Antony comes back after having married Octavia. But yes, I agree. I would love to know if that was intended to show the passage of time and the fact that they're not resolving this argument quickly, or whether it was something more on the production side. I mean, the fact that they were filming it in different costumes, but the same argument kind of suggests that maybe it was a deliberate choice, that they did want to show the passing of time. But it's hard to know because, as again we highlighted in the previous episode, but it bears mentioning here, originally this was meant to be two films, one called Caesar and Cleopatra and one called Cleopatra and Antony. And what ended up happening with the production nightmare that ensued is that the people who worked on the movie were forced to combine it into one very long epic. and therefore a lot of stuff obviously got cut out, and we unfortunately don't really know what that stuff was, because whilst at the end, I do have a statistic here for you, there was over 450,000 feet of film that was shot, which would have taken you 96 hours to watch.
Oh my goodness.
So there's definitely some missing footage out there somewhere.
I want the full release, please. The director's cut only.
That would be a hell of a director's cut. Whilst there's obviously there was extra footage that was shot, not a lot of it has ever managed to be recovered. It's quite fashionable, particularly in like the 90s. There was a real spate of doing these restorations. Spartacus was one of those films that got restored in the 90s. But Cleopatra, there hasn't been much footage that has showed up from those cuts, which is a real shame, because we know that the original director's cut was a lot longer than what we now have. I mean, there's a few disputes about the exact number, but I believe that Mankiewicz was actually taken off the film and was told he wasn't allowed to do the editing, but he eventually did get rehired. This is part of the production drama going on with studio heads changing at 20th Century Fox as they were trying to grimly cling to life and try and keep the studio afloat. And there were real disputes between the new head of Fox, who was Daryl Zanuck and Mankiewicz. Zanuck seems to have kind of switched his position from blaming the fact that this movie had been poorly managed by the film company to blaming Mankiewicz personally for a lot of the failings of this film and the fact that it went so over budget, etc. So he removed him, but then he did bring him back. But we know that his cut was originally a lot longer than what ended up being the cinema release because Zanuck was a bit more ruthless, probably because he didn't have that personal attachment to it. And then even after the release of the film, there were so many audience complaints about the film being boring and too long that it was then cut down again, which I think is the version that we now tend to watch.
Wow. Okay. So even watching it on the gloriously restored as much as possible Cleopatra DVD set,
Yes.
which I possess, which itself is a relic at this stage, maybe I'm not seeing the full flourishing glory that appeared in the cinema.
Well, it just depends. I mean, if you're watching something that's about 4 hours long, that's probably the original cinematic release. But if you're watching anything that's under 4 hours, then you are probably watching a truncated version that was cut down after people complained it was too boring and too much talking.
I hate it when people are talking all the time. No, I definitely watched the 4 hours. I'm very excited.
There you go. So you're probably watching the original cinematic release then.
Just too much talking. That's my review on that.
Exactly. Now, of course, we are focusing on the second half of this film today, and I feel like it's appropriate that we were talking about all these production issues because what a number of people who worked on this film have said that the person who suffered most from all the cutting that went on in the editing room was Mark Antony / Richard Burton, followed closely, you'll be pleased to know, Dr. G, by Roddy McDowall / Octavian.
Yeah, well, I mean, Cleopatra is clearly the star of the show, and Burton ends up, his Antony is often a brooding, grumpy pants, who is not very good at expressing his feelings and tends to blame Cleopatra for everything. That's how he comes across.
Yeah, well, this is exactly it. I think that a lot of people were very disappointed with the way that he came across in the final version, and they felt it was because you were missing a lot of the other side to him. They kind of just focused on one part of the storyline. However, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go into who is Richard Burton, Dr. G.
I believe he's an English actor, is he not?
Bite your tongue. He's a proud Welshman. Thank you very much.
Whoops. My apologies to all Welsh listeners out there. He is obviously an excellent Welsh actor.
Richard Burton is well known to us now because he became obviously a big star, and it's not that he was an unknown when Cleopatra was being made. And I don't know about you, Dr. G, but I could listen to his voice all day long.
Look, I do think he has a lovely vocal tone to him, and he does a good Shakespeare. That's what I'll say for him.
He does. So Richard Burton is an interesting person. He didn't come from like a massively wealthy background. He was kind of a self-educated man. Apparently could speak multiple languages, very well versed in Shakespeare and poetry and all that kind of thing. He was doing fairly well for himself when Cleopatra came along, but probably more on the stage than the screen. Most of the movies that he'd been in before Cleopatra had not been gigantic hits. So much so that when they found they needed a new person to play Antony and his name came up, the director / writer at this point was Joe Mankiewicz. He was a big fan of Burton. He thought he embodied the kind of qualities that they wanted for their Antony. However, the guy who was at that time the head of Fox wasn't interested. Okay, so this is Spiros Skouros.
Ah, yes. I recall this name.
Yeah, not interested, did not think that Burton was enough of a box office draw for an epic like this. Everyone else tried to really fight hard for him, like Wanger and Mankiewicz. They look, we've got Elizabeth Taylor. We don't really need any more of a box office draw than that. Let's give him a go. And so eventually, in May of 1961, they managed to talk screw us into hiring Burton. And in order to do that, they actually had to spend about $50,000 to get him out of a pre-existing contract he had for a musical on Broadway called Camelot.
Oh, he sings as well. Look at him go.
The reason why it's so interesting that Richard Burton, I think, ends up playing Mark Antony is that Mark Antony is represented a particular way in our source material, and that has an awful lot to do with your main man, Dr. G. Octavian / Augustus / the young Caesar, whatever you want to call him.
Yes. Augustus is the ultimate winner of the Civil War that we're going to see unfold to a high degree in this part of the film. And so it is his perspective on Antony that really resonates in the subsequent source material. And boy, is Antony portrayed as the villain. And part of this is because of the nature of the rivalry that Octavian / Augustus and Mark Antony share, which is they're basically competing for who is the best man left in Rome. This is the very tail end of what historians will talk about as the late Republic. And after this civil war, we move away from the idea of the Republic in really particular ways. But up until this point, it's always been about like personal competition in the public arena between men at a political level. Who has the best claim to be persuasive? And unfortunately, in this period, Mark Antony is not in Rome as much as Octavian is. So Octavian has a greater share of the listener's ears, of the persuasive folk, and he also does some things which are pretty terrible in order to sully Antony's reputation. And I'll get into some of that as we get further into like the action of the story of this film. But suffice it to say that he comes across poorly in our ancient source material, and this is then perhaps reflected in the portrayal we see on screen as well, because we know that for this movie, as you noted in the previous episode, some ancient sources are cited as inspirational writers.
They are, and one of the big influences is definitely Plutarch. And Plutarch is one of those writers who near and dear to my heart, Dr. G, because I feel like he has often inspired cinematic adaptations. I think his writing is at the heart of most popular versions of Spartacus's story. Not that he writes about Spartacus personally, but he writes about Crassus, and Spartacus comes up whilst he's doing that. And I think very much we see the moralistic way that Plutarch writes about Antony in his Life of Antony coming through a lot of the time in popular understandings of Mark Antony. And this is, I think, because of what Plutarch is doing, right? He writes biographies. Biography in the ancient world is about presenting exemplar. You want to live like this person. You don't want to live like this person. These are the qualities we value. These are the qualities we despise. And that is very clear in the Life of Mark Antony. It's not that he is demonized by Plutarch. And there's probably a reason for that I could even say is political. Let's face it, Mark Antony's bloodline is in that of the Julio-Claudians, thanks to his relationship with Octavian's sister, brief though it was. But also, I don't think anyone would want to completely trash his reputation, nor is it entirely in Octavian's interest to completely trash his reputation, just like they don't want to wholly undermine Cleopatra. You want to beat a worthy opponent. And also, can't like flat out lie about someone either. It's like what we often talk about. There's a lot of spin put on source material that we deal with. There are lots of gaps. People get a bit creative sometimes. But at the end of the day, it seems unlikely that our sources are trying to flat out lie a lot of the time.
Definitely. And certainly Octavian is skirting a pretty fine line during his lifetime in terms of what he says about Antony and when he says it.
Yes, absolutely. But definitely in Plutarch, we get this idea that Antony is a charismatic, convivial, well-liked person who unfortunately has particular weaknesses, which become more of a problem as he ages, and particularly in this period here where he's in his rivalry with Octavian. And one of those will end up being his love for women, particularly domineering women, like Fulvia, who was one of his earlier wives. And, well, actually, I shouldn't even say earlier wives. There's a bit of overlap between Cleopatra and Fulvia, isn't there? And then, obviously, Cleopatra as well. So we get material coming through talking about him as being kind of enslaved by his love for Cleopatra. I've even actually got a little excerpt here, which I thought kind of summed it up. So Plutarch says, "Such then was the nature of Antony, when now as a crowning evil his love for Cleopatra's supervened, roused and drove to frenzy many of the passions that were still hidden and quiescent in him, and dissipated and destroyed whatever good and saving qualities still offered resistance. And he was taken captive in this manner."
Goodness me. So we get something comparable from Appian, actually, in his Civil Wars, where he says Antony was amazed at Cleopatra's wit as well as her good looks, and became her captive as though he were a young man, although he was 40 years of age. It is said he was always very susceptible in this way, and that he had fallen in love with her at first sight long ago when she was still a girl. Awkward.
Gross.
And he was serving as master of the horse under Gabinius at Alexandria.
Which is referenced in this movie, by the way.
It is. I do like this little tidbit because the situation gets reversed. What we hear from Cleopatra in a scene when she's with Antony is that she had noticed him when he'd been in Alexandria under Gabinius. So the detail comes from Appian, but the credit in the film is given to Cleopatra, probably to smooth over the fact that it's a bit awkward for an adult man to be crushing on a young girl.
Yeah. She was
and they probably
12,
wanted to avoid that.
Yeah, exactly. And then I've also got a little quote from Florus, which I thought I would go to, because you can always rely on Florus for saying things incredibly brutally. I think he kind of takes original source material and then amps up just how dramatic it is. So he explicitly says that Antony was a slave to his love for Cleopatra. The Egyptian woman demanded the Roman Empire from the drunken general as the price of her favours, and this Antonius promised her, as though the Romans were more easily conquered than the Parthians. ... Forgetful of his country, his name, his toga, and the emblems of his office, he soon completely degenerated into the monster which he became, in feeling as well as in garb and dress.
Ooh, yes. And I see that the film definitely picks up on some of this stuff. So we rarely see Mark Antony wearing things that are particularly Roman in style. And he transitions very quickly to often appearing in clothing that we would interpret on screen as being more Greek in nature, which is in keeping with the Ptolemaic rule of Egypt at this time. And, well, these kinds of ideas coming through in Florus, in Plutarch, in Appian, they're all drawing upon the sorts of things that were said about Antony in the political invective of his day. Octavian is out there making those sorts of criticisms. Likewise, Cicero, not a fan of Mark Antony, lays in pretty hard. And so we do get a lot of historically preserved criticism of Antony. And from a Roman perspective, it makes a lot of sense. This is a guy who has left Rome, essentially, to the land that has been divvied up to him to look after. There's been an agreement between Octavian and Antony about which sections of the Roman Empire they'll look after respectively. On a strategic level, the lion's share has been given to Antony, but none of it includes Italy. And therein lies his problem, because he's sitting on the outskirts, he's supposed to be looking after a lot of territory, and I think from Antony's perspective, he's trying to make the best of it. It makes sense to get Cleopatra on side. She is in charge of Egypt, which is famously known as like the grain store of Rome. You need to have Egypt on side. How do you do that? Well, you take Cleopatra as a lover.
And you knock her up a few times, just for good measure.
Those children are always going to sell the grain to Rome at a good price.
Well, this is exactly it. So this is the picture we have of Antony coming through in the ancient sources. And obviously it's partly because of exactly the issue that you highlighted during his lifetime, and then the fact that he loses the civil war with Octavian, although Octavian wouldn't paint it as a civil war, but let's be real. And then on top of that, Octavian/Augustus happens to live completely unexpectedly for many, many decades after this victory, which means that he really gets to solidify his version of exactly what happened, what Antony was like, why he failed. And it's part of, I think, the strategy of the way that Octavian is trying to spin this particular conflict. He doesn't want it to appear like a civil war. He wants it to be a war against Cleopatra, against Egypt, which we all know in effect is also a war against Antony. But that's what I think he really wants to emphasize with what he is doing. It's really about Cleopatra. It's her fault. She's this foreign devil woman witch who has enslaved Antony with her Eastern charms. And that way it kind of softens the blow, I think, a little bit to Antony's reputation to paint him in this way, that it's Cleopatra using her charms and exploiting his vulnerabilities and weaknesses that have led to this situation. And this, I think, is what we see coming through in the film a little bit. But also, I think it comes down to what Mankiewicz, who was the main screenwriter and the director on this movie, he was very much drawing from Shaw and Shakespeare for his vision of things. And that makes sense because Shakespeare obviously used a lot of Plutarch as well, so that's probably partly where it came from. But also, he had a vision that Antony's main motivation was often this perceived sense of being less than Caesar, of having a bit of a chip on his shoulder after Caesar is assassinated, that he'll never be as good as Caesar. Which is an interesting take because I must admit that's something I don't think you get in the source material.
I think we have too much source material coming from Octavian's side to see that one coming through in particular. And I think you've made a good point about Augustus's legacy of being able to cement his own version of the story, because as we go through the histories, it doesn't seem like there's that much in it between these two.
Yeah.
In terms of the troops that they're able to bring to the table, in terms of who is supporting who. Like even at the height, just before the Battle of Actium, where Octavian does some things that I'll get into later. Some people in Rome leave. They walk out in support of Antony because they see part of what Octavian is doing as a violation of Roman values. And they walk out in defense of Antony over it. So it's not the case that Antony is lacking support in Rome, but it is the case that because he loses, his version of events doesn't get to have the same traction over time. And all of this is playing into how Antony gets portrayed in this film. From a Roman perspective, positioning Cleopatra as the main enemy is a huge insult to Antony. This means his masculinity has been completely undermined. No Roman worth their salt in their patriarchal system would allow themselves to be held under the sway of a woman like this. Antony seems up for it though, and in the same way that they criticize Fulvia for the way she behaves in a very active way, going out doing things in support of her husband, Cleopatra is like Fulvia writ large on a much grander scale. This is a woman who is in charge of a whole nation. The Romans aren't happy about that, but it does mean that Mark Antony can't be much of a man.
No, and this comes down to, as you say, that inherently Roman understanding of how power works. That in order to exercise imperium, in order to be a politician in Rome and make decisions for others, you need to be able to show that you can control yourself and your own household. You need to prove that you have the self-control, the discipline, the wisdom, all of those things that come together. And Antony, the way that he is painted with his tendency to be a drunkard, party a little bit too much, and sleep around, is seen as dangerous. It's seen as undermining that sense of Roman morality because it shows he has weakness. Like, it's fine to have sex with whoever you want within the, the rules of the Roman world for most people, but it has to be within those bounds. It's about that self-control, and Antony is seen as going beyond. And that's seen with his relationship with Fulvia, with Cleopatra. Plutarch has that famous quote, which I wish I had in front of me right now, where he talks about how Fulvia broke Antony in for Cleopatra because she was such a dominating wife. I think it's something along the lines of Fulvia wished to rule a ruler and command a commander, and that it's thanks to Fulvia that Cleopatra was able to just take over because Antony was used to following a woman's orders. That is exactly the kind of stuff where not being in control of yourself and having someone who's not supposed to exercise power in a Roman system having power over you, this is all like red flags, red flags. Antony should not be holding power. It's got to be Octavian, guys. He's the only logical choice.
Well, but I would like to put it out there that it's perfectly fine for a woman to be the dom and a man to be the sub. And realistically, Romans just need to get on board with that kind of stuff. And it's clear that they've got a long way to go. I'm really interested in talking about things to do with the scene where Mark Antony is kind of really early on in this part of the film is struggling in the East. And he doesn't want to go to Egypt. He's resisting going to Egypt and asking Cleopatra for help.
Mm-hmm.
And he's having some struggles with that because he thinks it's inappropriate for him to go to her. He wants her to come to him.
Yeah.
And he sends his faithful companion, Rufio, to go and get Cleopatra.
Who, by the way, I have to say, I think is the actual star of this movie. I love Rufio. He's great.
Rufio. I mean, he has his moments, that's for sure. And so he does the bidding of Antony in this. Cleopatra refuses. She says she isn't going to step outside Egypt. Why would she do that? Egypt is her place. He'll have to come to her. So they're having a tussle of the wills, which I quite like. And then is what happens next, which I think is, one, surprising, given what has just been said, but also fascinating. So I'm interested in your take on what is happening next with these two.
Well, this is their famous meet cute, isn't it? Even though we know, because we've just talked about it, that they probably crossed paths when Cleopatra was very young and Mark Antony was younger. Their meet cute in the source material is usually seen as them coming together on the barge at Tarsus. Now, this makes no sense because not only did they meet when Cleopatra was very young, potentially, but obviously they probably hung out all the freaking time when she was Caesar's partner. There's no way that when she was in Rome, for example, she and Antony weren't bumping into each other all the time. And we see this in the movie, right? Antony is there at meetings where Cleopatra is also present and Caesar is also present. But this is the moment where their relationship begins.
Something has changed. Somebody's dead. Someone's available.
Exactly.
And what happens in Cilicia stays in Cilicia.
Yeah. But this is actually one of those things, though, where I feel like it's made such a big deal of in the source material. And then it becomes kind of a staple, I think, of movies that go this far into Cleopatra's life. If they don't stop with the death of Caesar, for example, there are certain moments you just got to have. And the meeting at Tarsus is one of those. And you see that even in painting. So even if we're going into visual forms of telling this story before film is even invented, we see the meeting at Tarsus as being a moment that painters often go back to as well. And one of the things that also highlights the production problems with this film, because they were filming where they were in Italy, they actually had to build these boats. All of the battles and stuff, everything you see, they're not little miniature models that have then been made to look like real ships. These are actual ships that they had to build because they were filming in Italy.
I love that. I hope they kept those ships, but I'm guessing they didn't.
I actually don't know what happened to them, but I actually think that this barge scene, I feel like it actually wasn't a particularly early shot. I feel like when I was looking at the dates, I should have written this part down, but I feel like when I was looking at the dates of when they shot what, I feel like this was towards the end of the production that they shot it. And obviously it was a huge deal because it's a big set, having like a barge. They had to have the purple sails. They do explicitly note that they had to make them out of polyester rather than silk or cotton because they would have faded in the sun if they were made from natural fabric. So they were like, we can't be historically accurate. Sorry, guys.
We tried our best. It's amazing. But I do like this idea that the way they explain it and allow Cleopatra to keep her power and dignity in this moment is that she classifies the gigantic barge that she's brought all the way to Tarsus as Egypt. She's like, as long as I'm on this boat, I'm Egypt. And even then, Mark Antony's like, I'm not getting on that boat. And it's like, dude, she's actually come so close. All you have to do is take a step. she's making it so easy for you now. And he's still like grumpy pants about it. And then he gets really drunk at the dinner that she holds for him. The guy is just a bit of a loser. I mean, at this point, it seems like, well, we can see why he'd be into her. She's gorgeous. But, like, why would she be into him right now?
And this is exactly the thing, right? This, again, comes down to the way that the Antony comes across in this particular movie. The guy who ends up in charge of what we now know as 20th Century Fox, who took over after the boardroom coup, which takes place towards the end of the filming of this movie, is Darryl F. Zanuck. He takes the place of Skouros, and he ends up being the one to call the shots. Darryl F. Zanuck had a real issue with the way that Antony was portrayed in this movie as well. He actually thought that one of the big failings of the movie was the fact that Antony came across as weak. And he hated the way that their relationship came across. I believe his famous quote is that if he ever encountered a woman who treated him the way that Cleopatra treated Antony, he'd cut her balls off.
Okay. So this is somebody from the Roman mold who also needs to learn that it is okay for a lady to be in charge.
Yeah, look, Darryl F. Zanuck is someone who contributes a lot to cinema. He was a great filmmaker, but he was certainly a man of his time. It's pretty well documented, I believe, that he made extensive use of the casting couch system. I believe from 4 to 5 every day he would interview, and I'm using my flesh rabbits here, new acquisitions when he was in charge of studio. So he's a very man's man of this time, which we would now look at and say, bit of a sexist pig, I would imagine.
Yeah, sounds like it. A sex pest, and probably somebody who's sexually assaulting people by the sounds of it. Great.
Yeah, I'd definitely sexually exploiting people at the very least. But yeah, he is a typical man in position of power at this point in time, I think. But he is a great filmmaker. People marveled at the way that he was actually able to pinpoint issues when looking at films. So there's something to be said, I suppose, for his particular interpretation of the second half of the film as being the particular problem. And Mankiewicz and the people who defend him would say, well, that's because you cut out so much and it was meant to be 2 movies. Thank you very much. But we don't really know, obviously, because we don't see exactly what they were seeing because we don't have all the footage. But I think this is where we need to acknowledge, Dr. G, the thing that makes this movie particularly famous, which, of course, is the real-life affair that develops between Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. And this is the favourite part of always talking about this movie because you can't make this stuff up. It is so bizarre how much Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton seem to kind of embody the people that they are playing. Because, of course, Richard Burton is known as a fantastic acting talent, particularly, as you noted, with his Shakespearean abilities. Definitely acknowledged as a man with prodigious acting talent. Unfortunately, it was somewhat undermined by his drinking. He was a terrible alcoholic, and it seems from a defensiveness and an insecurity within him, perhaps feeling uncomfortable about the idea of kind of selling out and, going to Hollywood. And this is the movie that made him a big star. It's not just because he was playing Mark Antony in this movie, it's because of the affair that develops between him and Elizabeth Taylor. Whilst this movie was filming, he went from being somewhat known to being a household name. His salary, I think it's probably was times by about 50. Like, it was insane. He could command like $500,000 a picture after this. Can't really emphasize just how much this particular affair boosted him, and yet at the same time kind of was his undoing, in that it set his career on a particular path that it seems he wasn't entirely comfortable with and accepting of within himself. And I'm not sure that Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton were the best couple for each other. It's not that they didn't have a fiery, passionate romance. They obviously loved each other very much, but it seems to have been in a somewhat destructive mode. And you can kind of see that obviously in one of their most famous films together, once they were actually an established couple, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. If you've never seen that, it's a masterpiece. But again, almost because it seems like they're channeling a little bit how they actually were at certain points in their relationship. But I digress. Let's get into this, Dr. G. So Elizabeth Taylor, at the time of Cleopatra filming in 1962, is about 30 years old. Richard Burton is about 36. When they pulled Richard Burton out of his contract, again, this is speaking to the production issues, he actually didn't have a lot to do most of the time. They didn't budget their time very well because there was constant changes in shooting, et cetera, et cetera. So he was often just cooling his heels for a few months without much to do because of the fact that the scheduling was all over the place. And I once again must say that the biggest issue with this film, it does come down to the studio, just like with Spartacus. You should never start filming a big budget picture if you don't have a complete script. And that's what it comes down to all the time. It makes it very interesting for people like me who love to see how history gets thrown together, but it means that the history a lot of the time is actually, quite frankly, completely chaotic and random because it's purely born of a lack of time.
Yeah, you just got to get through it as best you can. Throw it in there, do something. I'm not sure this is the sort of thing that would ever fly today in terms of making a film. If you didn't have a robust script and if you hadn't planned it all,
sorry, excuse me,
and if you hadn't planned it all out correctly in terms of your storyboarding and things like that, there's no way you'd get to a point where you'd get funded. So the idea that studios are just sort of kind of like, we've got an idea and we've got half a script, let's start, I feel like this is very mid-20th century approaches to filming.
Well, look, I disagree, actually. I think that kind of stuff does still happen. I think it just depends how it comes together. If you've got like a big name, a big director, and an idea that seems to work, sometimes I think these things can still happen. But part of the reason why it happens, obviously, with this production is that they need to get filming because the studio is hemorrhaging money and it's such an expensive shoot. I mean, the sums are a little bit different depending on what point in the production you're talking about. But even if they don't film anything, it's costing like $65,000 in like 1960s money just to keep the production itself going. So it's a huge amount of money. Elizabeth Taylor alone is getting $3,000 a week in expenses. So just the amount of money that this kind of film is hemorrhaging. And so they're pushing to just get started with the actual filming. and it's just such a bad idea. Everyone tries to point it out to them. Mankiewicz is like, look, what if we just had a finished script and then I'd know exactly where I was going? And this is why we have so much footage, because Mankiewicz is writing after he's finished filming for the day and on weekends for a lot of this production, which means that you're not getting his best work. You're getting what he's pumping out while popped up on drugs and then coming down from things and whilst he's exhausted and tired. And his method, because of what the pressure the studio is putting on them to film, is to film everything and then cut it out later, which is so expensive to do. It's not at all cost effective. And it means that they're probably creating sets and costumes and stuff that were unnecessary because they end up on the cutting room floor. But nonetheless, I'm digressing once again. Let's talk about Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. So, much like Cleopatra and Antony, they had met before. They were not strangers to each other. Yes. They hadn't exactly hit it off. They didn't hate each other, but wasn't really much chemistry when they met the first time, and they didn't know each other super well. However, on January 22nd, 1962, the first scene was shot that involved both Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. And it was apparently the scene where all Caesar's friends, who are senators in Rome, are meeting at Cleopatra's villa while she's hanging out, and they're all milling around and discussing things. Now, if we are to believe what was written later, everyone sensed electricity between Taylor and Burton immediately. However, they're good-looking people. Could be nothing. Yeah. But it's on January 26, 1962, that Walter Wanger, in his diaries, his published diaries, records that Joseph Mankiewicz, director/screenwriter, called him in to tell him that he's pretty sure there's an affair going on between Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton because he's quite friendly with them and he doesn't really want to keep it a secret that there is something going on. To backtrack a little bit to what we talked about last episode, keep in mind that Elizabeth Taylor already had just copped a lot of flack for breaking up somebody else's marriage with Debbie Reynolds and Eddie Fisher. And she's only just recently married Eddie Fisher herself. Richard Burton is in a slightly different boat in that he has been married to one person for a little bit of time and has children with that person, Sybil, his wife. Now, Richard Burton had a reputation, and this is where, again, it's kind of weird. So not only is he a bit boozy, like Mark Antony supposedly was, although who knows.
Who better to cast in the role?
But, like Mark Antony supposedly was, Richard Burton was a womanizer. He kind of prided himself, I think, on bedding every leading lady he acted across. And his wife kind of knew about that, but always looked the other way, I guess, and saw it as just something to tolerate and that it wasn't anything serious and that their relationship was solid because he was that classic case of, oh, he always comes home after playing around, you know, he'll always come home to his wife, he'll never leave her.
Oh, the 20th century, just
I know, right?
I'm unhappy already. This is going badly. First you're telling me about this film guy, now you're telling me about Burton. Boo, hiss.
I don't know if this makes it any better or worse, but I know that Daryl Zanuck wasn't the only one doing that.
That does not make it okay.
Yeah. Anyway, so very quickly, rumours get out. And this is, again, partly to do with not just the magnitude of this production. I mean, it's taking up so much space and everything at Cinecittà, you know, Rome. But it's also the fact that this is Elizabeth Taylor we're talking about. She's just kind of got a bit more sympathy back after all her health problems and the fact that she almost died. And everyone kind of acknowledges that she won an Oscar for Butterfield 8, kind of because they were like, oh, you almost died. We forgive you, have an Oscar. Not really because it was her best role or anything like that, but she's just getting that sympathy back. Nonetheless, she's glamorous, people are interested. And the paparazzi are a feature of life in Rome at this time, like really intrusive press photographers. We are familiar with that in our world, but it actually wasn't something that you would necessarily encounter everywhere. And it's not that there isn't like a media industry surrounding the film industry in America. Obviously there is. But this is, I think, much more chaotic, much less controlled. They are much more intrusive. There are all sorts of things that they try in order to get the inside word on the production. It seems that people who are working for Elizabeth Taylor and Eddie Fisher in their home are probably on the payroll of the paparazzi. We're talking about a film production which has thousands of people employed as laborers and extras and that sort of thing. So it's super easy to get people involved somehow if you promise them a bit of cash and they can get you some inside photos. One of the more notorious incidents, which was documented by the producer Walter Wanger, was that they found out that there was a woman who had been hired to work in the publicity department, who was wearing a very big bouffant 1960s style coif on her head as like her hairdo, and it's because she was actually hiding a camera in there.
What? Amazing.
There was even an incident when two priests presented themselves asking for donations at the Burton residence, and luckily the housekeeper was like, who exactly did you say you were collecting for? It turns out these guys were paparazzi just trying to get inside the Burton household and get a bit of a scoop, because by February, the rumours are everywhere about a love affair between Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton and what this potentially means.
Wow. The timeline is very short.
It is. It seems to develop remarkably quickly.
They see each other and they're like, you know what? Let's do it.
It's on. Yes, Richard Burton's not exactly discreet about it. Chris Mankiewicz, who was the son of Joe Mankiewicz and was working on the film as a younger man, reported that Richard Burton walked into his makeup trailer one day and announced that he had screwed Miss Taylor the night before. So, you know.
Well, that man's not keeping secrets, is he?
No, not exactly. Now, you might imagine that the studio would be thrilled about this, right? Because any publicity is good publicity. Sex sells.
Yeah. It adds to the drama. And it's like, ooh, what are they going to be like on screen together? I've heard that they're doing it. And it's like, and now I need to see it for myself.
There is some awareness of this. There's a very famous quote from one of the publicists on the film saying everyone's going to want to see this film to try and see on screen what they know is happening off screen. But there is actually also a lot of fear about a romance like this between two people who are married to other people. And they actually referred to it at one point as a cancer that will destroy us all.
Oh.
Yeah, and this kind of highlights the hypocrisy, which actually Walter Wanger was somewhat aware of and sort of wrote about. Even though this is the early 1960s we're talking about, the swinging 60s attitude has not fully kicked in. We've still got some real 1950s hangovers. For a public affair like this between two married people, you know, adultery writ large, this is not okay. And it's particularly not okay on Elizabeth Taylor's part, obviously. It makes her seem very much like the Octavian version of Cleopatra.
Ah, yes. All right. Well, so Octavian does portray Cleopatra very poorly in his dealings, and obviously it's to his benefit to do so because he needs to manufacture consent for his war against Egypt / Antony. And one of the great ways to do that is through denigrating Cleopatra. And I think this leads really nicely to the issue that crops up in 32 BCE, which is jumping ahead in terms of the action of the film, but is very illustrative of what Octavian is up to, because we do get this scene where he reveals the contents of Mark Antony's will in Rome. And it is this that is seen as the impetus that turns any doubters that are left in the city to Octavian's side, because the contents of that will is explosive. Mark Antony is giving everything to Cleopatra and his children with her, and basically setting up for himself to be buried in Egypt as well. Now, was that will a real will? So these are all sorts of problems that historians have, because apparently Mark Antony had deposited his will with the Vestal Virgins. This is where I become interested in this story.
I was going to say, this is where our interests collide, Dr. G.
Yes. All of a sudden, you've mentioned my favorite people, Vestal Virgins. So one of the roles that the Vestal Virgins had during the late Republic is to hold important documents. They were seen as a bit of a repository, a safety deposit box, if you like, of Rome, which makes sense because
who's more trustworthy than a virgin? Yeah.
Well, lock it in that safe. One of the things that the Vestal Virgins hold on to and keep inside the temple are the signals of imperial power. So they represent the safety of the state. So the idea is if you put a document with the Vestals, it'll be as safe as it possibly could be. Ho, 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 Antony, you could not be more wrong. That is not how it works. Octavian manages to demand that the Vestals release the will to him, to the point where they can no longer resist his demands for it. He then also seems to have managed to persuade the two individuals who had placed their witnessing seals on Mark Antony's will to change sides. And there's a whole bunch of illegality with this, because the role of those two as witnesses to the will itself is to verify it when it's opened upon the death of the person whose will it is. And Mark Antony is not dead in 32 BCE when that will is opened. But they do nevertheless stand up and publicly verify that those are their seals, and they endorse the contents that are about to be revealed. All of this is part of a bigger play by Octavian to produce the required emotional response. So there's good reason to question whether this will is real, but we don't know.
And we'll likely never know.
And the film navigates this as well, because it is part of Octavian's limited screen time to reveal these details to the Romans in a way that allows them to be like, yes, we need to go into battle. We will turn up to Actium. Let's do the business.
I think this is very interesting because the fact that they chose to include that part, I think, is trying to once again show how subservient Antony has become to his Cleopatra. And I would have liked to almost have seen some more of these difficult scenes be tackled, but it would have been hard because one of the things that they don't do in this movie is they don't show the fact that Cleopatra and Antony also have children with each other. It's just cesarean. It's cesarean and that's it. Cleopatra's a one and done kind of mum in this particular story, which means you don't get to see the donations of Alexandria. You get this reference to the idea that Antony is tossing the empire in Cleopatra's no doubt very well-deserving lap, as Octavian says, but you don't get to see the full moment of the donations of Alexandria. And that's always an episode in the Antony and Cleopatra story that I find particularly intriguing. I think we only get it in Plutarch's account, but we get this description of Antony staging this very elaborate pageant where he's all dressed up, Cleopatra's all dressed up, their children are all dressed up, Caesarion's there as well. They are given these crazy titles, and he divvies up all this land between them, some of which is definitely not his to give away. It's obviously just a title thing, and some of their children are like toddlers. They're like 4 years old. So the idea that they were going to command it anyway is weird. And he definitely, I think, highlights in the Donations of Alexandria that Caesarion is Caesar's actual son. I think it's the first time he sort of comes out and publicly says it, that Caesarion is definitely Caesar's son and that he's kind of his rightful heir is, I think, the implication of that. So this would seem to be, I think, almost a moment where Antony is perhaps trying to do his own version of like a propaganda war against Octavian. But the way that it's been documented in our surviving material, I think, again, is trying to show that Antony isn't thinking straight.
Wow, how could he be? He's under the sway of that woman.
Yes, exactly. And the funny thing is, I had not actually realized how quickly Taylor and Burton's romance also exploded. I mean, I knew it happened during filming, but the pace of it is really crazy. So essentially, they start filming together in January. They start sleeping together, it would seem, by the end of January. February, everyone kind of knows about it and wants to know more about it, but they're trying to minimize word getting out. Deny is the attitude. And the studio obviously have a love-hate relationship with this particular affair because on one hand, it's getting a lot of attention for the film, which they need because they need this expensive film to work. But it's also a negative thing because of the moral judgments involved. And it's in April that we start to get Taylor and Burton sort of giving up, kind of shrugging their shoulders and deciding that they're going to give the paparazzi what they want, which is photos of the two of them together. Nothing overly sexual, but definitely out and about like a couple, you know, holding hands, well-dressed and that kind of thing. And after they do that and seemingly kind of give the paparazzi this information, we get a very big denunciation of Elizabeth Taylor by the Vatican in April of 1962.
Well, there's a shock. I'm more thinking about Sybil and Eddie, the respective spouses of the two, maybe calling each other up and being like, what the hell is going on?
Yeah, well, there's this very public denunciation of Elizabeth Taylor by the Vatican. There's also a very nasty open letter which is published in a Vatican newspaper, not by the Vatican themselves, but by a reader, and obviously it's one of their newspapers. I'll read you some of the famous quotes from this letter. So they basically rip into her for having short and frequent marriages. They say, even considering the one that was finished by a natural solution, as in the marriage that resulted in her husband's death in a plane crash, there remain 3 husbands buried with no other motive than a greater love killed the one before. And they go on to say, essentially, think of the children, Elizabeth Taylor, for God's sakes, think of the children. These children need an honoured name more than a famous name, a serious mother more than a beautiful mother, a stable father rather than a newcomer who can be dismissed at any time.
Wow. Okay. Well, I hope somebody's written an equally shocking letter about Burton and his ridiculous antics, because that would make it fair.
They did not. And the US papers obviously pick up on this, and it gets published all over the United States as well. So Elizabeth Taylor and Burton are told to sort of lay low, but they end up sneaking off without telling anybody and going on a little weekend away. This gets reported on, and I think it's around this time in sort of late April that the news of the affair spreads from just sort of tabloid, trashy kind of newspapers into more serious newspapers like the Sunday Times. And this is when Sybil Burton starts paying attention because she's learnt to look the other way. And even though her house is surrounded by reporters and her children are being followed, she's actually just ignoring it, as she always has, apparently, and not giving in to the emotions of the situation. But when she sees it being reported in what she views as a serious newspaper, this is when she starts to get upset and think, oh my God, maybe this isn't just, you know, an on-set affair like all the others.
Wow. Sybil, I'm so sorry.
I know. It's really horrible. And there's all sorts of things which obviously got misreported. Like there are stories about Elizabeth Taylor having like a suicide attempt, which everyone is fairly certain was just food poisoning that got misreported. So there is a certain amount of misreporting going on here. Richard Burton ended up dubbing it Le Scandale. But it is Elizabeth Taylor that cops most of the negativity, because most Italians obviously are Catholics at this point in time. So a lot of them, if she's out in the street, abuse her as like a whore and a homewrecker. Whereas Richard Burton doesn't cop that kind of abuse, which again is a little bit like it was in ancient Rome.
I was going to say, this was a real mirror to the way ancient Rome treated these sorts of things as well, because it's definitely Cleopatra who is receiving the brunt of the criticism, and throwing Mark Antony under the bus is just part of the cherry on top, as it were.
Absolutely. So whilst there was definitely a lot of fear about this affair, it seems that after about 4 or 5 months, everyone realised that, okay, this is not just an affair. This is becoming a relationship. And we start to, I think, see that the other marriages with Eddie Fisher and Sybil Burton are over, essentially. And Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton are kind of making a go of it for real. Now, this is important in terms of how people receive the history, okay? Particularly if you're watching it in the aftermath. By the time I was watching this as a teenager, obviously Richard Burton was dead, I think, and Elizabeth Taylor wasn't far off. And so I was well aware that they do end up being together, that they do end up getting married, a couple of years later. They even liked each other so much that after they got divorced in 1974, they got married again, not long after that, and then they got divorced again. So I was kind of aware about how their story played out, but I know that for a while it was pretty real, and they made some very interesting movies together as a partnership. And even after their divorce, they were still, I think, passionately in love with each other. They just couldn't be together. So I kind of wonder if that coloured perhaps the way that I viewed it, as opposed to how someone viewed it at the time. Because I think with all the gigantic amount of press that was around it. I mean, the reports about it are insane in terms of it was the only story that anybody wanted. People were paying insane amounts to get pictures of them together, particularly like candid shots, not just photos of them doing what they were supposed to be doing on set. It was the biggest story of the time. In fact, basically the hottest ticket for like a visiting important person, even if they were nothing to do with the film industry, was a visit to the set of Cleopatra, because it was just all anybody cared about. I kind of feel like maybe one of the reasons why people seem to have been kind of underwhelmed by this film at the time is because there was so much hype about the Taylor-Burton, Cleopatra, Antony romance. Whereas when I looked at it, I hadn't had to live through that hype. And so I wasn't as underwhelmed when I sort of see their relationship play out on screen. I don't know. How did you feel when you were watching them together, Dr. G?
I think I'm in a similar position as yourself, because we're of the same generation. So I obviously knew about how it turns out in the end for Elizabeth Taylor and Burton. And I think if I'm putting myself in the shoes of somebody who was watching it in the cinema in 1963, like what would have that been like? And I would have been looking for the passion on screen between these two. And we certainly get a sense that there is something between them. Definitely the relationship between Cleopatra and Antony on screen in this film is quite different and far more passionate than the relationship between Cleopatra and Julius Caesar.
Yeah.
But we also have the nature of the way that Cleopatra has really attached herself to Julius Caesar over the course of her early political career. And so I think about scenes like on the barge, where Mark Antony notices Cleopatra's necklace, which is made of coins that have the face of Julius Caesar on them, which I kind of love as an artifact. And I was like, would she have done something like that? That's kind of amazing. But I feel like that's quite dramatic. And him ripping that necklace off, because for him, as Mark Antony, this is a moment of jealousy. And it's like, that man is dead. He's dead and gone. And you need to get over him. And I'm right here in front of you, flesh and blood, as in charge of Rome as I possibly can be. And what are you doing? And this idea then quickly transitions to Cleopatra's revelation that she actually did find him quite attractive and fell in love with him from afar when she was a young girl.
She kept that secret the whole time she was with Caesar, didn't she?
Yeah, don't mention my crush on Mark Antony.
Oh my God, that's embarrassing.
I was just a girl and he was pretty hot. And luckily, Richard Burton's a pretty good-looking guy, I would say, for his time period, and he holds up on screen quite well, but is nothing like what we know Mark Antony looked like from the ancient sources. But obviously Cleopatra is in the same sort of situation because she has come through over time and has been received as an incredible beauty when all of the source material does try to draw attention to the fact she's actually intelligent, and the visualizations we have for her, she seems like, a woman. It's not like the bust of Nefertiti or something where you're like, that woman is an incredible beauty.
Yeah.
It is like Cleopatra, the bust that we have of her and the coinage that we have for her suggests that she's in charge and she's a woman and she looks like a chick.
Yeah.
Cool. She may have been quite beautiful in real life and she may have presented and come across in terms of her character as quite charismatic, but we don't get the sense that like she's like supermodel or anything like that, which is kind of how the reception has moved over time, particularly in the West. So Elizabeth Taylor is kind of like the exceptional 20th century height of that. And subsequent actresses who have played Cleopatra sort of fit into that Hollywood mold as well. And it's like, it's got to be somebody who's exceptionally good looking, because surely that's the only way to be in charge of a whole country as a lady. You don't hire Angela Merkel to play Cleopatra, although maybe you could. That'd be more, somebody with some political savvy. But no, forget about that. So we get these kinds of ideas coming through, I think, where we want to see the passion on screen, and we do see it come through in various ways. I mentioned that argument that has been sliced and diced in different ways, and it looks like it's either a deliberate montage or a production disaster. I don't know. But we see those arguments happening between them, and we get the sense that there is a fieriness between these characters, which we also simultaneously suspect is the fieriness that is between these two people. It doesn't seem like there's a huge line between the acting and who they are. And maybe that's part of the appeal of this movie, is that we feel like in some ways that when we're watching it, we're not watching Cleopatra and Mark Antony, we're actually watching the blossoming and complexing of the relationship between Taylor and Burton that runs through the whole thing. And he gets more and more angry as the film goes on. So when we get to Actium, and it is all going so wrong, Mark Antony spirals. And I feel like watching it from the vantage point of a millennial, that what I'm seeing is the way that Burton is probably going to spiral over the course of his marriage with Elizabeth Taylor.
And this is what's so weird about it, right? Because it's exactly that. When you look at it at a superficial level, Burton's, this party boy and drinker and womanizer, but with talent, which seems to sum up the version of Antony that we get. Cleopatra is a sexy, intelligent politician, which is kind of the version that we get, with a lot of extravagance, obviously, because she's insanely wealthy and she's extremely powerful in the style of a Hellenistic monarch, which is judged, I think, by the Roman sources, but it's actually just how it was in her part of the world, which is a little bit like Elizabeth Taylor, who was insanely wealthy and made a fortune off of Cleopatra, not just because of the way that her contract stipulated her salary, which was, as you know, like the first time a woman got paid $1 million to play a role, but also the nature of the ongoing financial support that she had and the fact that the production stretched well beyond what they were anticipating. And then the Todd AO stuff, her production company being involved. And then she also actually had a clause in her contract that she kept making money on any subsequent releases, so like videos, DVDs, that kind of stuff. So
Amazing.
Elizabeth Taylor walked away from Cleopatra, a very wealthy woman. It was not a financial flop as far as she was concerned, even though it might not have been the greatest thing for the studio ever. But then their relationship becomes one where it seems that it's partying, it's excess, it's booze, it's passion, which kind of seems to be a bit like the version of Antony and Cleopatra that, again, we get in what I can only assume is somewhat Augustan propaganda. That idea that they had that society of the inimitable livers They get dressed up like slave girls and low-class people and go out on the town and get into all sorts of mischief. They have crazy, extravagant feasts. It's obviously propaganda, but for Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, it's kind of true. I mean, there's even a famous jewel that he gives her to add to her incredible collection that is called the Cartier-Burton diamond. And we do see Burton kind of descend into alcoholism, his talent not fully realized because of this. Now, I would never say that it's because of Elizabeth Taylor that happened, but it does seem that Cleopatra is a moment which sets his career and life on a particular trajectory, as I said before, which means that he loses the stability that he had, I guess, with his relationship with Sybil and his children and his family life. And again, we kind of get the sense that Antony loses the stability that he had with Fulvia and Octavia by turning away from his Roman wives for his Cleopatra. So it is kind of an interesting parallel, but I think that is also because of the propaganda surrounding both of these stories. Cleopatra and Antony suffer from the propaganda wars. Taylor and Burton, I mean, their relationship was under a microscope from the get-go. I therefore feel that that's perhaps why people were a bit underwhelmed. And also the fact that there's a very distinct difference in the tones between the first part of the movie with Caesar and then the second part of the movie with Antony. And I think that's because they were meant to be separated. You see Cleopatra much more in the style of a lover in the second part, whereas in the first part, she's much more the politician.
Well, but we also see a dichotomy set up for her in terms of how men respond to her as a powerful individual. So if we take the Battle of Actium as an example of this, she's on the main general ship, which makes sense. You're not going to put her in one of the war vessels. She's back where the strategy is happening. But Antony is out and about for some reason. He's decided to lead from the front, which is an odd choice. But the fact that she stayed behind and she's involved in the decision making, and when she learns the details that it's unlikely that Antony has survived, she's like, okay, it's time to skip out of here. Let's go. So she's decisive. She's a decision maker. It doesn't go well for her on the day, but she can see the pragmatism of having to get back to her homeland, skip out of there, do the business. Mark Antony cannot handle the fact that Cleopatra is a pragmatic leader. This is when he starts to spiral. This is the beginning of the end for him. He can't believe that she's left when, for all money, she thinks he must be dead. And it makes sense for her to go. He can't handle it. And he never really comes back from that. Everything about him in this movie and in this portrayal of Antony is now a downward spiral towards the end. And he gets a bit of an epic ending. He has this scene which I can't verify in historical sources, but I kind of enjoy it anyway, where he decides that when he hears that Octavian is coming, he's like, all right, we've got to set up, we've got to meet them. Sets up a camp. Everybody abandons him. He wakes up the next morning.
Everyone's gonna know, it's so sad.
His camp is empty. And I was like, buddy, you have lost everybody. He decides desperately to do a one-person charge against the Roman forces anyway. Doesn't go well and has to retreat. And then we're just like, a step or two away from the noble suicide. So for Mark Antony, seeing Cleopatra in action as a war leader, as a pragmatic person, it's not something that he can handle. Whereas I feel like if the situation had been different, and let's say that Cleopatra was on the same ship and it was Julius Caesar out there, Julius Caesar would not have decided to go out and lead from the front, I don't think, because he's not that kind of guy.
No.
But he also wouldn't have blamed Cleopatra if she had left, if she thought he was dead, because he's a bit more pragmatic in the same way that she is. So there's something fantastical about Antony's desire for how Cleopatra should be and what he thinks leadership might entail when he's also in it, which I think is really fascinating. I think they've given a nuance to his character, or at least the performance that Burton has brought to that has really emphasized that there is a delicate weakness to Antony in all of this, which is ultimately connected to Cleopatra, but the weakness comes from him.
And this is, I suppose, maybe what we can sort of start to wrap up on. This movie often cops a lot of flack for destroying the studio system, for almost bringing down 20th Century Fox, which did actually eventually recoup its money from Cleopatra, but only once the rights, I think, were sold to television and DVD releases and that sort of thing. So it took a long time for them to actually make money on this movie. But I kind of see that as being their fault, quite frankly. As Joe Mankiewicz said, Cleopatra was first conceived in emergency, shot in hysteria, and wound up in blind panic. And the studio does make a lot of decisions which are super questionable and cause a lot of these expenses, on top of the fact that life happens and the accidents make it even more expensive on top of that. And so I don't like it when people talk too negatively about this film, because I still feel like it actually is a really good movie. I do see its flaws. I do see its weaknesses, which I see again as being the result of the hurried way that it was all put together. But I think Elizabeth Taylor also cops a lot of flack for this film because she is seen as, like Cleopatra, a metaphor for Hollywood itself, of its waste, its extravagance, its greed, its lack of morality, all of that kind of stuff, which I actually don't think is entirely fair. I think a bit like Cleopatra was the victim of propaganda from Octavian, Elizabeth Taylor has come to be the face of this film and what it represents. And she's criticised a lot because she did actually walk away with quite a tidy little sum from this movie. But I don't think that's exactly fair. I think that she's an actress. This is a business. She actually made a really shrewd deal, which the studio entirely signed up for. Therefore, why shouldn't she make the money that's in her contract? And she herself also, I think, was really passionate about this film. She actually refused to attend a lot of the American premieres in solidarity with the fact that this was not the film that she and Joe Mankiewicz and Walter Wang and all those other people wanted it to be. She felt it didn't live up to the vision that they had, that it was meant to be a film about a really intelligent woman with a vision, and that was lost with all the editing drama that went on. And there is a lot of parallel, I have to say, between the making of Cleopatra and Spartacus. They both are films that a lot of their weaknesses come from the fact that script was not locked down before they started filming. And then on top of that, there were movements in the studios that were controlling those movies in terms of the executives that were in charge. Those executives have different visions and different reactions to the film. And so there was movement at the sort of executive level, which then impacted the way that the film was edited. And that editing then has an impact on how it all came together, because with Joe Mankiewicz only being able to do a certain amount of the editing and Daryl Zanuck kind of also making executive cuts, it's just not what they had planned. And then I think by the time it came out, that it was maybe a bit out of sync with the world as it was then. But when you think about when the movie started to be produced, that was 1958. That's when the idea germinated. They started filming in 1960. By the time it comes out, sure, it's 1963, and attitudes are changing, the world is changing.
It's a long period, it's a long gestation process for a film to go through as well, and for have so many different voices disunified in their idea about what it should be to try and bring it together. It
suffered from a lot of bad blood, I think, because not only were critics very harsh, and I feel like they were very harsh partly because of the big build-up towards it. I mean, a critic in Newsweek actually said, all that remains are the high points. At 6 hours, Cleopatra might have been a movie. At 4 hours, it is the longest coming attraction for something that will never come. And I actually think that that's probably a bit of a fair point. But again, I don't think the creatives are necessarily the people to blame here in this particular story. But also, it also does not kill the production of epics. There are epics that come after this, and we still make epics to this day. I mean, I think you can look at obviously like things like the Marvel and Star Wars and all of that kind of stuff, Avatars, your Titanics. Epics can still be really big box office business. The problem is when they fail, they just become spectacle.
Yeah, look, I'd love to see some of the cutting room floor footage from this film, and as you say, not a lot of it has come out. It would be really interesting to see what the best version of this film could have looked like, and I think we'll probably always be dissatisfied in that regard.
Again, very like Spartacus. There were things that were added in, once Zanuck was in charge, like filming of battle scenes, like Pharsalia and Philippi, which were filmed and added in. And there were meant to be extra scenes, I think, with Richard Burton, but they never happened because he was on another project by the time that they got around to doing it or something along those lines. So like with Spartacus, the vision is muddled because the production was muddled. And so we don't perhaps get the Cleopatra that we want. We don't perhaps get the Antony entirely that we want. Caesar probably is the one that gets the most credit. Rex Harrison was actually nominated for a Best Supporting Actor for his role as Julius Caesar.
Oh.
And he would go on, like a year later, to win Best Actor. Actually, was it Best Actor? I think it was Best Actor for playing Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady.
Well, there you go.
The interesting thing, which kind of sums up, I suppose, the way that this film was sort of envisioned when they were promoting this film, the original posters that they started putting out were of Elizabeth Taylor very slinkily reclining on a couch, and behind her, like a creep, Antony kind of over the top of her. And Rex Harrison was nowhere to be seen. It was only because he kicked up a stink that you have Caesar added in as a third character, which is crazy because he's the one that most people actually enjoyed his performance.
Dear, oh dear. Well, what a complicated and interesting representation of Rome and Egypt on film.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad that we've spent this time talking about it and delving into the details. And look, justice for Octavian, because, they give him the scene where he doesn't participate in the Battle of Actium and makes it very clear that he's been sitting on the sidelines.
I will acknowledge it is definitely said that Richard Burton suffered the most because apparently his performance as Antony was magnificent and people think a lot of his best scenes ended up on the cutting room floor. But they also highlight that Roddy McDowall, who was brought onto the film to play Octavian because he was a friend of Elizabeth Taylor's, also suffered a lot. He also had a lot more material, and instead he becomes this very drab little character. Although I do enjoy his scenes, but he certainly comes across as, well, let's say a version of Augustus that would appeal to me.
Look, I think he comes across really well. There's this smarminess to his performance, which I really appreciate. And I feel like he's giving it his best shot based on like what the ancient source material is like.
He's a schemer for sure. But yeah, it's certainly not a version of Augustus, I think, that many people would recognize, which is interesting. All right, Dr. G. Well, I think we talked for almost as long as the original cut of Cleopatra.
It seems fair. It seems to do it honor and service.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Partial Historians. You can find our sources, sound credits, and an automated transcript in our show notes. Our music is by Bettina Joy de Guzman. The Partial Historians is part of the Memory Collective, creators and educators dedicated to sharing knowledge that is accessible, contextualised, socially conscious, and inclusive. To find more from the Memory Collective, head to collectivemem.com. Today we would like to send our gratitude to all of our Patreons who make special episodes like this one possible. If you would also like early and ad-free episodes, please consider joining our partial band. Until next time, we are yours in ancient Rome.